So welcome and hello, I'm Madison Dennis, a project manager at Plastic Pollution Coalition, and thank you for joining our September webinar, Policy Matters, Solutions for a Plastic Pollution-Free U.S. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a nonprofit communications and advocacy organization that collaborates with an expansive global alliance of organizations, businesses, and individuals to create a more just, equitable, and regenerative world free of plastic pollution and its toxic impacts. We have 4 poll questions today to get a sense of who is joining us. Each question will only appear for about 20 seconds, so please answer quickly. Poll question 1, where are you joining us from today? Awesome, seeing a lot from the US, which makes sense with the topic. Also, Europe and North Asia, Central and South America, Caribbean islands. Great, on to poll number 2. What best describes the area of focus of your work? Seeing a really wide spread, we have corporations and businesses, education and academia, government and policy, healthcare, media, lots from nonprofits, research, and other. Great to have such a diverse group here today. Poll number 3, if you are from the United States, what region do you reside in? Select one. Awesome, looks like a great spread. We have New England, Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, Midwest, some from the Rockies, Southwest, Pacific Coastal, and the US territories, covering the whole gamut. And our last question, poll number 4, do you think the US government and policymakers are doing enough to address plastic pollution? Select one. Looks like a lot of responses. We could be doing more, and that's what we're here to discuss today, how we can make plastic pollution a problem of the past. So I will now pass it on to introduce our panelists. Today, we're going to hear from Jonathan Black, Joan Mooney, and Jane Patton in conversation with Christy Levitt, Campaign Director for Oceana. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Christy Levitt. Christy Levitt is Oceana's Plastic Campaign Director, overseeing the organization's U.S. initiatives to address the plastic pollution crisis. Under her leadership, Oceana has campaigned to pass more than a dozen state laws and 60 local plastic reduction policies. This fall, she'll be featured in a new PBS documentary called We're All Plastic People Now, about the pervasiveness of plastic pollution in our lives. Welcome, Christy.
Thanks, Madison. I'm happy to be here and wanted to start off just saying a couple of things and we'll go on to our panelists. This week is Climate Week in New York City, and it's a really great time to dig into our conversation about national level US policy to address the plastic pollution crisis, because as many of you know, almost all plastic is made from fossil fuels. From the extraction of fossil fuels from the ground to the production of plastic to the disposal and incineration of plastic waste, plastic creates pollution. And I imagine many people are here familiar with the problems of plastic pollution and have heard about its impact on our oceans, our climate, our health, and our communities. We know that recycling plastic won't solve this problem, and that the true solution is to go to the source and reduce the amount of plastic being produced and used. And while that responsibility should fall primarily on the companies that produce and use plastic, governments play a critical role here, especially when companies aren't acting on their own. And the good news is that countries around the world are taking action. More than 90 countries have passed laws to reduce single-use plastics. Many of those are focused on banning or placing a fee on specific single-use plastic items, with a growing number of national policies being more comprehensive, some addressing multiple types of plastic and taking other actions. In the US, cities and states have been leading the way. Just this year, so far, 3 states have passed new laws that phase out plastic foam foodware or other single-use plastics. And yesterday, the governor of Massachusetts announced a ban on state agencies purchasing single-use plastic bottles. So we're seeing action, momentum is building, and now is a critical time for national level solutions in the US. With that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Jonathan Black. Jonathan is Senior Director for Chemical Safety and Plastic Pollution Prevention at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He previously served as a Special Assistant to the President and Senate Legislative Liaison, where he worked on some of President Biden's signature legislative achievements. Prior to that, Jonathan worked for nearly 20 years in the U.S. Senate, where he focused on energy and environmental issues, including chemical safety and plastic pollution issues. We're excited to have you here with us today, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chrissy, and thanks to the Plastic Pollution Coalition for inviting me to today's session on plastics policy in the U.S. and for introducing me to the audience. I'll start by giving a little background about myself, about the U.S. White House Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, and the work my team is doing to undertake and address plastic pollution. So last year, CEQ, which is a component of the Executive Office of the President, hired me to lead the Chemical Safety and Plastic Pollution Prevention team. CEQ's role is really to coordinate federal government's efforts to improve, preserve, and protect America's public health and environment. And as you mentioned, Christy, prior to working at CEQ, I worked for Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico in Congress. And I know many folks from the Plastic Pollution Coalition from that time there when I worked on a variety of chemical safety and plastic pollution issues, especially at the time when plastic pollution policy was gaining a lot of momentum right before COVID. Senator Udall retired from the Senate, and I wanted to continue that plastic pollution work with the Biden administration, but as Christy mentioned, took a bit of a detour, first by working at the White House Office of Legislative Affairs, and in that capacity, worked on a number of the president's priorities, like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, but was always interested in returning to direct policy work on plastic pollution prevention because there is so much to be done. And so it's an honor to lead this portfolio at CEQ, where I've also been able to assemble a small team of staff here by pulling from other agencies in the federal government to come and do rotations here. At CEQ, toxics and chemicals have long been an issue under our umbrella, but since my appointment about a year ago, this is really the first time in history of the White House that there's a team and staff dedicated specifically to addressing plastic pollution. So we hope that that signals that this has become a priority for the Biden-Harris administration, that there are people now focused directly on that. Our work here at CEQ on plastic is really guided by several principles. First, President Biden has advanced the most ambitious environmental justice agenda in our nation's history. In alignment with that commitment, we recognize that the plastic pollution crisis is an environmental justice issue with overburdened and underserved communities in the U.S. and globally, bearing social, economic, and public health burdens across the entire life cycle of plastics. Plastic emits pollution at every stage of its life cycle, from extraction of raw materials to manufacturing of plastics to pollution of post-consumer products. We believe we must address all of it. Second, the United States will prioritize public health, economic development, and environmental justice to ensure that the benefits of acting on plastic pollution, including jobs, minimized exposure to harmful chemicals, and healthy communities are available to all. Third, plastic and product manufacturers should bear responsibility for addressing plastic pollution through product design, redesign, waste management, cleanup, transparency, and education. Fourth, there are many types of single-use plastics that are unnecessary, difficult to recycle, and cause harm when released into the environment. So the reduction of these should be prioritized to the maximum extent practical. And finally, we recognize the importance that effective recycling plays in addressing the plastic waste crisis, but acknowledge that we cannot recycle our way out of the growing crisis through recycling alone. Broadly speaking, at CEQ, we focus on interagency policy coordination. What is the interagency? It's the whole federal government, all the different departments and agencies. like the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, and like. And so we aim to support projects and initiatives related to the administration's policy priorities on plastic pollution, among all of them. In terms of the former, we are coordinating federal actions through a new Interagency Policy Committee, or IPC. This is on plastic pollution and the circular economy. And we formed the IPC and publicly announced it in April when the president signed Executive Order 14096, the Revitalizing Our Nation's Commitment to Environmental Justice for All. We had the goals of prioritizing public health, economic development, environmental justice to ensure that the benefits of acting on plastic pollution, including jobs, minimize exposure to harmful chemicals, and clean communities, are available to all. While there have been many interagency working groups and efforts to address plastic pollution, this is the first White House-led working group focused specifically on a comprehensive plastic pollution strategy. Convening members of the federal agencies working on plastic pollution has affirmed that across this government, there are broad and ambitious federal efforts to address plastic across its life cycle. Some examples include the Department of the Interior secretarial order to phase out single-use plastics across office and bureaus, which builds upon our efforts to reduce waste in our national parks through National Park Service Zero Landfill Initiative, and the installation of water refill stations across many federal agencies. I think Jane will be talking more about some of that. Agencies are also addressing and monitoring the upstream impacts of plastic including through the Environmental Protection Agency's Toxic Release Inventory Program, which characterizes upstream pollutants associated with plastics manufacture and tracks progress of the elimination or reduction of certain chemicals used in the manufacture of plastic products. A plastic manufacturing profile has been incorporated into the 2021 Toxics Release Inventory National Analysis. Source reduction efforts are taking place domestically. Agencies are tackling that, how they're trying to handle their own agencies, as well as internationally through the U.S. Agency for International Development's Clean Cities Blue Ocean Program, whose progress includes diverting 1,800 metric tons of plastic and other low-value waste in over 20 cities. EPA and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, are also supporting downstream efforts, including through financing innovative waste management for recycling, reuse, and repair infrastructure with the recently released Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling grants, and through remediation of waste from the environment in both the trash-free water and marine debris programs that they run. In line with the administration's commitment to environmental justice and its Justice 40 goals, federal programs across the government are taking into account environmental justice and program design and implementation. Across the administration, agencies are embedding environmental justice into their work and meaningfully engaging with local communities. So there's a lot happening that I won't have time to share all today, and we acknowledge that there's a lot left to go. I saw poll result number 4, so we were not taking it personally. We agree there's much more that needs to be done, but the amount of effort undertaken by agencies is indicative of a serious commitment to address this problem. We are also active in advancing U.S. objectives in ongoing negotiations for a global instrument on plastic pollution. This includes participating in interagency discussions with the Department of State to coordinate the U.S. approach to the global instrument, encouraging ambition from the U.S. and navigating how our domestic efforts will impact international work and vice versa. I was in Paris for the second International Negotiating Committee meeting for the second round of negotiations, and look forward to continuing to support the U.S. government's work on the plastic pollution prevention at the international level. We also appreciate the opportunity to engage often with stakeholders and across all sectors to advance multi-sectoral efforts on plastic that complement our policy work. Additionally, hopefully folks know that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency released a draft national strategy to prevent plastic pollution in April of this year. CEQ supports the three primary objectives of the draft national strategy, which help show the path to achieve our vision of a healthy and safe environment. One, to reduce pollution during plastic production. Two, to improve post-use materials management. And three, to prevent trash and micro nanoplastics from entering waterways and remove such trash from the environment. Many proposed actions in the draft national strategy could be taken by the federal government to meet these objectives, but others can only occur through effective partnerships, leadership, and solutions by the private sector, nonprofits, and state and local governments. And so, the Biden-Harris administration is enthusiastic about multi-sector solutions that drive a truly circular economy, and we encourage solutions to the plastic pollution crisis that are not only innovative, but also yield climate justice benefits. Our vision for circular economy includes reuse, recycle, composting infrastructure that creates benefits and opportunities for the many and not the few. We want to see these systems not only in our markets, but in our schools, our parks, our events, our government facilities, and more. Investments in reuse systems, for example, can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and single-use items and water, and also generate local economic benefits by creating jobs and building resilience through local infrastructure. We know that combating plastic pollution requires broad and innovative approaches. So as governments are moving forward, we are looking forward to all of society, including the private sector and the NGO community, to catalyze the transition to a new, green, safe, and circular economy. And we're grateful to be in this space and to be a part of an open dialogue about how to do that, and look forward to a fruitful discussion. So let me turn it back to you, Chrissy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Next, I would like to introduce Joan Mooney. Joan is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget for the U.S. Department of the Interior. Previously, Joan was President and CEO of the Faith and Politics Institute. She's also served as Assistant Secretary of Veterans Affairs for Congressional and Legislative Affairs, leading efforts to secure significant increases in agency funding. And she has been Chief of Staff and Budget Associate for a Western Oregon Member of Congress. So welcome, Joan.
Thanks so much, Christy, and thank you all. I'm really excited to be here today. Christy mentioned my title, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget. And what that really means is the folks in my office head up policy management and our budget for the entire Department of the Interior and all of our component bureaus. But I'm really lucky because as part of my role, I serve as Chief Sustainability Officer for the Department of the Interior, where I lead agency-wide implementation of sustainability and climate adaptation policy. So one of the priority goals that we're tackling at the department, as many of you know, is plastic waste. And in our Secretary Deb Haaland's words, the Interior Department has an obligation to play a leading role in reducing the impact of plastic waste on our ecosystems and on our climate. As the steward of the nation's public lands, including our national parks and national wildlife refuges, as the agency responsible for the conservation and management of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats, we at Interior are uniquely positioned to do better for our Earth. Interior, as some of you know, manages more than 480 million acres of public lands, 2.5 billion acres of the Outer Continental Shelf, and 750 million acres of marine national monuments across more than 2,000 locations that host nearly 400 million visitors each year. And as steward of 20% of the nation's lands, including our national parks and our wildlife refuges, the federal agency responsible for the conservation, management of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats, and producer of nearly 80,000 tons of municipal solid waste in fiscal year 2020, The Department of the Interior must play a leading role in the Biden-Harris administration's work to address the plastic waste and the impact of it on our ecosystems and on our climate. So here at Interior, we're proud to be part of the Biden-Harris administration's whole of government approach to addressing the challenges of our time, including bolstering climate resilience as we manage our facilities and work with the private sector to acquire products and services. And that's why in June of 2022, Secretary Haaland issued Secretarial Order 3407, which aims to reduce the procurement, sale, and distribution of single-use plastic products and packaging, with the goal of phasing out these single-use plastic products on department-managed lands by 2032, 10 years. Interior has made progress towards these ambitious goals, progress that's going to be critical for protecting our natural environment and the communities that depend on them. We believe everybody has a role to play in reducing and eliminating plastic pollution. One of the biggest opportunities that we have at Interior to reduce plastic pollution is in what our visitors, clients, and other stakeholders take away from their experiences on Interior managed lands. Educational products and programs can help bring to life the impacts of plastic on our environment and how our personal choices and actions can make a difference. For instance, Interior works with hundreds of volunteer groups across the country to coordinate litter cleanup events, many of which are on beaches and specifically target plastic pollution. Cleanups regularly take place at coastal national wildlife refuges, islands within marine national monuments, national seashores, and other interior coastal lands that accumulate marine debris, including plastic. And an exciting example of this area is a 5-year partnership between the National Park Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and their marine debris program to raise awareness about the sources and impacts of marine debris and to encourage individuals to take action to prevent marine plastic pollution, resulting in outreach opportunities in 15 coastal parks. And so this Saturday, September 23rd, is National Public Lands Day, traditionally the nation's largest single-day volunteer effort. So parks, refuges, and other public lands across the nation will join with hundreds of thousands of volunteers who want to help their community by working together with people of all ages and diverse backgrounds to restore and protect our shared spaces. And to find events in your area, Google National Public Lands Day, and we look forward to seeing you.
Thank you, Joan. And now I would like to introduce our final panelist, Jane Patton. Jane is the U.S. Fossil Fuel Economy Campaign Manager at the Center for International Environmental Law. Since 2016, Jane's work has focused on organizing and coordinating groups around the world and in her home state of Louisiana in the fight against petrochemical pollution, plastics, and carbon capture and storage. Thanks for joining us today, Jane.
Thanks, Christy, and I'm so excited to be here today. As Christy said, I work for CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, and CL has actually been one of the fundamental groups in recognizing and really telling the story of how plastics are a lifeline of the fossil fuel industry, along with agrochemicals and carbon capture and storage, as Christy outlined in my introduction. Now, of course, fossil fuels have contributed enormously to the United States economy, but they're also the main perpetrators of climate change. And it is high time for the fossil fuel companies to be held accountable for the damage they've done to the environment and to human health. CL actually works on a number of fronts to be able to bring about this reality: the law, international and domestic, existing and new. We use the law as a tool of protection and accountability, and we support the creation of new laws when gaps are identified. We're also doing organizing, we do campaign and coalition work, we do education and community support. when it comes to protecting people and the planet from plastics, there are major gaps in law, policy, and practice that have been clearly identified, some of which have already been named in this conversation. CL actually works on the front lines, in the courts, and in the places where laws are made to fill those gaps. I have the honor and privilege of doing that work from my lifelong home in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I live and work daily on the front lines of climate change and with some truly incredible people who are not only in this because they care about people in the environment, but who are genuinely concerned about their current health and the future survivability of their children, their grandchildren, and their neighbors. The South Louisiana is actually the front line of both climate change and petrochemical pollution, partly because of the fact that the Gulf of Mexico and the seas around us are rising so quickly, and because they are producing so much more extreme hurricanes and other extreme weather. But also because that in South Louisiana and South Texas, there is actually the nation's largest concentration of plastics production and petrochemical production. So we are really getting hit in multiple places. And in South Louisiana, the failure of our government to keep us safe and even acknowledge that there is a problem at hand is really front of mind for people who do this kind of work. And CL really has the honor of not just employing folks like me and some of my colleagues who live down in Louisiana and have lived there our whole lives, but also working with communities to fight this and working from the community all the way up to the United Nations. And other places of power to be able to redistribute some of that power and to work together on solutions. All of our work is actually done in coalition, which is something we're also really quite proud of. We are particularly proud to support and facilitate the global coalition of civil society and rights holders that are weighing in on the plastics treaty that Jonathan mentioned, that has been the focus of my work for the last 2 years. And as the threat from petrochemical production, plastics pollution, and climate change has become more acute in my home in New Orleans, my work is actually now refocused on the United States, on my community and communities like mine, that are really on the front line and the front edge of harm from this industry. And myself, my colleagues, my coalition members, and CL, we remain concerned about the influence of the plastics industry in U.S. plastics policy, in state plastics policy, especially in places like Louisiana and Texas. And we work to focus the solutions conversation on the fates of all people, but especially those that are already hurt first and worst by the plastics crisis. Of course, my face is not the representative face of communities, those communities that are hurt first and worst. We know that in the United States in particular, it is Black and Brown communities who are not even asked, but are often just burdened with the emissions burden and the acute health and climate threat from plastics production, and often also from plastics pollution. So CL is really working across all these fronts, and not only in partnership with these communities who have visions of a future that doesn't include plastics production and plastic pollution, but also in partnership with groups that are looking to change law, to change the policy, and to really bring these solutions home, and to bring the solutions from home to the place where law and policy is being made, so that we can all have a future where we're not just surviving, but we're thriving. And that is the work that I'm excited to be able to bring to this conversation, especially among such great panelists and with an incredible group of participants. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Christy.
Thank you, Jane. Before we jump into the discussion Q&A, I want to take a moment to share some about the congressional bills that have been, or we expect to have them introduced. Versions of all of these bills were introduced in previous sessions of Congress, so we have some knowledge about what's in them, even the ones that haven't been introduced yet. So first up is Reducing Waste in National Parks Act. This has already been introduced in both the House and the Senate, and this bill would put into law the phasing out of the sale and distribution of single-use plastic products across all national parks. So it echoes a lot of what's in the secretarial order, but codifies it into the law. Second is the Plastic Pellet-Free Waters Act. This has been introduced in the Senate, and we expect it to be introduced in the House in the future. What this bill does is require the US EPA to prohibit the discharge of plastic pellets or nurdles, as some of you might know them, and other pre-production plastics into US waterways. And then there's the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. We expect this to be reintroduced in both the House and the Senate. And this is a comprehensive bill that would build on successful state laws and includes a set of practical plastic reduction policies, such as phasing out some of the most problematic single-use plastics, putting a pause on new and expanded plastic production facilities, and holding plastic polluters accountable for their waste. Protecting Communities from Plastic Act is also expected to be introduced in the House and Senate, and this bill would crack down on plastic production. It builds on some key provisions in the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act to really address the harmful environmental justice impacts of the plastic sector, and it moves the economy away from the over-reliance on single-use plastic. Last bill on this list is called the Reduce Act. And this bill was actually reintroduced today in both the House and Senate. What this bill does, it would put a 20-cent per pound fee on all virgin plastic resin used to make single-use plastic products. So that's what we know and anticipate will be introduced in Congress. There may be additional bills. Since we focused primarily on the administration, I wanted to make sure folks saw some of what was happening in Congress. So now we're going to move on to our discussion part of the panel. I'll start by asking some of the panelists some of the questions that have been submitted by attendees ahead of time. And please keep adding questions to in the Q&A feature. We'll do our best to answer them too. So first question for the panel, what is being done on the national level to make companies responsible for their plastic packaging? And Jonathan, we can start with you, and Jane, I imagine you might have some things on that too. And holler if you need me to repeat the question.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I'd start by, acknowledging that, there is not a national level extended producer responsibility policy for packaging in the U.S. I think it was mentioned earlier that there are a number of states that are embarking on this, have passed legislation, and some considering it. So I think, all those conversations are really important. I think, the EPA and other folks are looking at this, trying to figure out ways in which we can support and offer technical advice throughout the various different regions on some of these systems, but there is not right now a very cohesive, plan across the national level. A lot of, waste management is localized, and so we're trying to figure out how to square all that. But love to hear from others.
Jane?
Yeah, and I think that there are ways that we can be working to hold corporations accountable that are not just things like EPR schemes. Some of the participants in this conversation have likely heard about practices to hold consumer goods companies accountable through things like brand audits and being able to really make them feel and see the visibility of their logo and their presence in the plastics pollution that we are dealing with in our streets, in our parks, in our waterways. That is one, that public accountability is a form of accountability. There's also work that's being undertaken to do things like hold plastics producers accountable for the emissions that they are putting out in the air when it comes to actually making those plastics. Again, part of that is about public education and is about making sure that folks are aware of the fact that the concerns with plastic pollution is also about emissions. And a key part of that is, frankly, the courts. And there are increasing, we're seeing different states attorneys general. We're seeing different private people and private and NGO groups come together to think about ways that courts can actually be used to hold corporations accountable, not just for the plastics that are visible in the environment, but also for the emissions that come from plastics production. And all of that work is work that can be touched on and supported by members of the public who can do cleanups that's more than just a cleanup, that is also a brand audit, who can really choose to invest their personal money where you have that choice in companies that are trying to reduce packaging or go plastic free or package free. But we're also in a place where money is tighter for most people in this country than it has ever been. So there are also opportunities for us to talk to our neighbors and to work with our neighbors to be able to change local law and policy and to be able to influence some of the conversations that are being had at the courts that actually push the law beyond the limits of what it can currently do, which is really exciting.
Some of the bills that I was mentioning before that have been introduced or expect to be introduced in Congress will also address this issue too, like the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act and the Protecting Communities from Plastic Act. All right, the next question is, the U.S. is the largest producer of plastics in the world. This means there are many communities who live along the fence line of heavy toxic industries. Can you talk about what is or should be done to protect these folks from plastics? Jane?
Yes, I'll go ahead and step in because I actually think a lot more of the policy questions are going to be for Jonathan and Joan, which is great. Also, just realizing that all of our names start with J, so hello. I am actually, you heard me mention this in my opening comments that a lot of the work that CL does is really on the fence line of these communities. And I don't know how many people who are with us today are actually familiar with, if you've ever seen a plastics production facility, if you've ever driven by one or smelled the air around a facility. I talk to folks on the regular, I don't live on the other side of a literal fence from a plastic pollution production facility, but I live within a couple of miles of one. But I talk to folks every day who can smell the difference in the air when a facility has had an emission accident or has had to go through some change of phase in which they emitted different kinds of chemicals or more chemicals than they normally do. The community has gotten used to being able to smell the air and know how, for instance, it is going to affect their children at school, how it is going to affect their need to put eye drops in or to wear a respirator mask, not just for COVID, but to protect yourself from what's in the air. Whether they can let their children play outside. This is a serious concern that people have to be mindful of every single day. There are definitely efforts under national policies like the TSCA, the toxic chemicals. I always forget what it stands for, but it's the law on toxic chemicals that is actually pretty tight on requiring transparency, on limiting emissions. But we see that there is very frequently a disconnect between the law that we see at the federal level and the way things are implemented at the state level. And at the end of the day, all of these plastic production facilities are issued a permit by state or federal agencies that allow them to put carcinogenic chemicals into the air. And I'm going to say that one more time, because this is not a spill. All of these facilities are issued permits that allow them to put certain levels of carcinogenic chemicals into the local community. And that is a big, big, big concern. And that fact alone is one that very few people actually know. So it's really inspiring and encouraging to work with frontline communities who are recognizing that the fact that they have to know what different chemicals smell like is actually an injustice, and that there is something that we can do together when we work together and when we sit in rooms and we put Post-it notes on the wall and we wrestle with our personal issues and we talk about, whether your mom's sick and what's everybody's favorite gumbo recipe. And we debate whether or not you put potato salad or rice in the gumbo. It's definitely rice. But this is the kinds of things we get to do as a community, and being able to really weave those things together in this fight for, frankly, our lives is one of the best parts of my work. And I am really excited to see not just to see the power that comes out of a frontline community, especially considering the harm that is wrought against frontlines. And it's a joyful place to be able to work with folks who are working for their own survival.
Thanks, Jane. I'm going to jump into the next question because we've got a list here. Let's see how far we can get into it. What are some ways that the U.S. government can invest in refill and reuse systems, infrastructure, and industry? And what's happening to move this industry forward? Joan?
I can take that. Well, here at Interior, we're working closely with our private partners to reduce the single-use plastic products through contracting and procurement policies and processes. And I'm lucky that that's actually one of the responsibilities of my office. So as Chief Sustainability Officer, I'm also Chief Acquisition Officer, and I can look very closely at these things. So from campaigns to be plastic straw free to eliminating plastic bags in retail stores and single-use toiletry containers in our hotel rooms and interior sites, these are all things that we're doing, and we're leveraging these contracting and procurement process, working with food service providers and our souvenir vendors and other concessionaires and contractors to reduce the sale of single-use plastic here on Department of Interior managed lands. We're also working to incentivize action by ensuring reuse systems are available for our employees and visitors to our lands. So one priority is to provide additional water bottle filling stations for our staff and our visitors. And these are, as everybody knows, just a critical alternative to purchasing or bringing along a single-use plastic water bottle. So we've accelerated actions to install filling stations that were previously underway, including some at our most visited national parks areas, like the National Mall that's right across the street from you now, the Cape Cod National Seashore. And instead of selling these single-use water bottles, we're selling reusable water bottles at these sites. Several national parks sell propane for camping stoves and reusable tanks that can be returned and refilled. And then Fish and Wildlife Service runs the National Conservation and Training Center here in West Virginia. There's a reuse program for student groups who come to the facility where food is provided in reusable containers that are collected separately from recyclables and waste. Additionally, and I talked about the amount of waste we have going to landfills, we're trying to divert that. And Interior collects solid waste and recycling information every year to track our progress towards achieving diversion rates for municipal solid waste and construction and demolition debris of at least 50% by 2025, 75% by 2030 in all of our bureaus and offices. And in some cases, we're working with public and private partners to support these projects.
Thanks, Joan. All right, next question. Is the U.S. government, administration, or Congress looking into the toxicity of plastics and actively working to establish protections, toxic designations, or at least labeling that denotes toxic chemicals? Jonathan, can I throw that one to you first?
Yeah, sure. Yes, we are. CEQ's plastic work is under the umbrella of plastic pollution prevention and chemical safety, and we recognize all these issues are intertwined. An example of what I mentioned earlier was EPA's Toxic Release Inventory Program, which serves as a resource for learning about toxic chemical releases and pollution prevention activities reported by industrial and federal facilities. A plastics manufacturing profile has been incorporated into the 2021 Toxic Release Inventory National Analysis. Jane mentioned or tried to the Toxic Substance Control Act earlier, TSCA. That is the law that was reformed in 2016, and EPA is working to implement and address various different chemicals and the likes, and to regulate them. So there are a number of things. EPA also has a safer choice program, which tries to label some of these products and things like that. So there's a number of work going on that front. Let me just quickly sort of piggyback and say, really love what Joan and Interior are doing on the reuse front. We here at CEQ are super jazzed about reuse and pushing for that. I attended an event on Earth Day of this year, promoting reuse here at some of our music venues in Washington, D.C. And it's really just a simple concept that, can, reduce pollution and improve jobs and better economic fortunes. So just wanted to make that little plug.
Thanks. All right, we are getting short on time, so I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll do a quick go around for any final thoughts from the panelists. What is being done about stopping advanced recycling, in quotes? Incineration and plastics to fuel is not recycling. Any thoughts on that? on the panel? Jonathan, I'll go to you.
Well, I know that there are a lot of discussions right now and looking into all these different types of technologies or processes for recycling and the likes. I don't want to sort of, get ahead of some of those processes here. We're very interested in innovative solutions, but we want those innovative solutions to be environmentally sound, to not have more damage to, that we're trying to prevent. I think advanced recycling certainly a hot topic in all of these discussions. EPA very much in the mix of sort of looking through the inputs and the outputs and trying to make assessments on that. I think categorically we definitely do not see waste to fuel as an appropriate plan for recycling, or if that's how folks are thinking about that. I don't know that they are, but that's just not something that we've really seen great effort for. So.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll have more conversations about chemical recycling as time goes on, as well as hopefully more reuse and refill. As we are getting close to time here, want to give each of the panelists one more chance if you've got any final thoughts that you want to say. Joan, start with you if there's anything in the final wrap up.
No, I just want to say I was excited to be here today, and here at the department we're very excitedly executing Secretary Holland's executive order to phase out single-use plastics by 2032. This is great, and we've had great support from many organizations, including Oceana, that have given us thoughtful feedback as we move along. So grateful. You know how to get a hold of us. If you have any issues or concerns at Interior, please let us know. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. Thanks for your work. Jane?
I just want to say in closing here, there is so much more that all of us can be doing. And I think including the folks who are in, positions of power, there's so much more that we can be doing to protect communities, but also to uplift solutions that are really about reducing plastics production, that are about reducing the flow of plastics into the environment, and that are about figuring out how to deal with the plastics in the environment in ways that are not unjust and that don't then sort of perpetuate different problems. The solutions here are at hand, and part of it is that we have to wade through very intense pressure and very difficult economic situations to be able to come up with those solutions and implement them and really uplift them. I am, what is the word I'm looking for? Heartened. I am heartened by the solutions that are coming out of the community. I am continually impressed by the waste diversion systems that come out of communities, the refill and reuse systems that come out of communities, and just the generative, innovative, ambitious solutions that communities are able to come up with when you put it in their hands. And so I feel like there is a lot more that can be done here, and that there is a lot more that needs to be done to actually be bringing resources to the community, holding these fossil fuel and plastics industries to account, and really actually uplifting the power of people that needs to be brought to bear here. So I hear the good solutions from Jonathan and Joan and other folks across the U.S. government agencies, and I'm also really looking forward to even more, not to put more pressure on you guys, but I feel like you can take it. And I'm hoping that we will be able to dream those things up together, and we'll be able to really empower communities to envision a different future that's not the one we currently live in. So someday I hope to be just a pie maker in my community and not a campaigner against the fossil fuel industry. And I hope that other folks get to live out a dream and a future that is much more joyful for them than having to do these fights every day. So thank you for your work so far to both of you. And I also hope that everyone listening is really inspired to get involved and be part of a coordinated solution.
Thanks, Jane. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. And I'm glad to hear that Jane is heartened. This issue can be overwhelming I certainly feel that from my perch, knowing how much we have to do. I certainly appreciate the 10 people in poll 4 that thought we're doing enough but need to do more. So, I think I agree with Jane here. We all know that we do need to do more. And, I see my time here, is a short stint. It's limited. We're trying to do as much as we can to move the federal government and to move the stakeholders. And that really does require a lot of support from the folks that are on this call. It's great to see so many attendees. But I really do encourage everyone to, stay involved. I think if you're like me, we all try and make these changes at our daily personal lives, but we know that it's really going to take broader systemic change to see the outcomes that we want to prevent the pollution from ruining our homes, neighborhoods, parks, and water and the like. So really encourage everyone to stay involved, to push for change, to push us. We'll continue to hear that. We want to do more. We want to do better. That's what we're striving to do. So.
Great. Well, a big thank you to Jonathan Black, Joan, Mooney, and Jane Patton for joining today. Appreciate all the work you three are doing. Look forward to continuing to work with all of you. And I'm going to turn it over to Madison to wrap up the call.
Thank you, Christy, for leading the great discussion with our panel. Just a note, we had so many great questions in the Q&A that we unfortunately didn't have time to get to all of. We have captured these questions and we'll do our best to get answers from our panelists to share with you all in a follow-up email. Now, everyone, please mark your calendar for our next webinar, tentatively planned for October 19th, Policy Matters, the UN Global Plastics Treaty. And if you haven't already, we invite you to join our global coalition. It's currently free to join as an individual, business, or nonprofit organization. You can connect with us on social media to learn more about our work. We'll also be sending a follow-up survey after the webinar, and we really appreciate your feedback to help us improve our future events. We will also send out the recording of this webinar in the coming days so that you can share it with anyone who was unable to join us today. Thanks again to everyone for joining. Thanks also to our Plastic Pollution Coalition member groups and partners who shared this webinar and their communities and networks. We look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar in October. See you soon.